1. I'm a teacher from English. Today I will conduct the lesson Formative and Summative Assessment from English Teaching Methodology. Outline: definition, purpose of each type of assessment, a comparison between two types, examples, advantage and disadvantage of each types, conclusion. Okay, let's start our new lesson. Firstly, we will talk about formative assessment. What is formative assessment? Formative assessment is a set of formal and informal assessment tools undertaken by the teachers at the time of learning process. It is known as formative assessment. It is a part of the instructional process, which is undertaken by the teacher's ongoing evaluation with an objective of enhancing the student's understanding and competency by modifying teaching and learning methods. Formative assessment. Formative assessment attempts to provide direct and detailed feedback to both teachers and students regarding the performance and learning of students. It is a continuous process that observes the student's needs and progress to help the teacher determine the next step during learning process. Summative assessment. Next type of assessment. What is summative assessment? Summative assessment refers to the evaluation of students that focuses on result. It's a part of grading process which is given periodically to the learners, usually at the conclusion of the course, term or unit. The purpose is to check the knowledge of the students and to what extent they have learned the material taught to them. Summative assessment seeks to evaluate the effectiveness of the course or program, check the learning process, etc. Scores, grades, or percentage obtaining to act an indicator that shows the quality of the curriculum and forms a basis for the ranking in schools. Purposes of the formative assessment. Firstly, monitor student learning and provide ongoing feedback to staff and students. Next, it helps students identify their strengths and weaknesses, can enable students to improve their self-regularity skills so that they manage their education in a less haphazard fashion than is commonly found. It also provides information to the faculty about the areas students are struggling with so that sufficient support can be put in place. Helps teachers identify the current state of learners' knowledge and skills, make changes in instructions so that students meet with success, create appreciate lessons, activities, and grouping, and informing students about their progress to help them set goals. The purpose of the summative assessment. Firstly, to evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. Second, it's a tool to evaluate the curriculum and training process. Third, to determine the extent to which the instructional objectives have been met. Fourth, the more we have information about the students, the clearer the picture we have about achievement or where gaps might occur. Sixth, to certify student master of the intended learning outcomes as well as use it for assigning grades. Lastly, summative assessments often have high stakes and are treated by the students as a predatory of formative assessment. Comparison between two types. Basis for comparison, formative assessment and summative assessment. What is the meaning of formative assessment? Formative assessment refers to a variety of assessment procedures that provide the required information to adjust teaching during the learning process. Meaning of the summative assessment. Summative assessment is defined as a standard for evaluating learning of students. Next, nature. The nature of formative assessment is diagnostic, but the nature of summative assessment is evaluative. What is it? What is formative assessment? It is an assessment for learning. What is summative assessment? It is an assessment of learning. Frequency. Frequency of formative assessment several times during an instructional unit. Frequency, summative assessment, end of the term, year or semester. Aims at formative assessment. Enhancing learning, improving learning. Aims at summative assessment, measuring students' competency. Goal. What is the goal of formative assessment? Goal of formative assessment is monitor student learning. Goal. Summative assessment. It is evaluate student learning. Weight of grades. Weight of grades formative assessment. Low stakes, not graded. Feedback. Weight of grades summative assessment. High stakes, graded, scored result. Examples. For example, in formative assessment, observation, concept map, research proposal, quizzes, homework, worksheets, performance tasks, essays, questionnaire strategies, projects, graphing organizer, self-assessment, peer assessment, collaborative activities, portfolios, collection of student work. Examples for summative assessment. Examples: final performance task, final papers, written outputs, final oral presentations, standardized tests, end of unit tests or projects, recitals, long exams, periodical tests, final examples. In formative assessment, we can use observations for teachers or for students, quizzes, homework, worksheets, essays, etc. In summative assessment, teachers usually use final performances tasks of students, final papers, written outputs. Advantages. As we know, there are several advantages and disadvantages of summative assessment. We will see what are the advantages of summative assessment. What are the disadvantages of summative assessment? Firstly, we will talk about advantages of summative assessment. First, summative assessment used to determine whether or to what degree students have been taught. Next, general evaluation rather than diagnostic. It's more appreciably used to determine learning process and achievement. Evaluates the effectiveness of educational programs. Next, make course placement decisions among other possible applications. On the other hand, summative assessment has some different disadvantages. Okay, what are the disadvantages of summative assessment? Firstly, not always the most accurate reflection of learning. Second, they do nothing to identify and remedy instructional problems before they become critical. Last, having one big test makes everyone anxious and is disruptive to school life in a way. Next, advantages and disadvantages of formative assessment. As we know, formative assessment also have some advantages and different disadvantages. Firstly, we will see advantages of formative assessment. First, not graded. Second, students are motivated to be more adventurous, more creative. Third, quickly highlights real problems, helps determine the next step during the learning process, helps students monitor their own process. Monitor tracks the students' progress throughout the entire teaching learning process. Last, helps teachers identify students' needs, problems, errors, and learning gaps and resolve them immediately. Disadvantages: time-consuming discussion and activities, difficult to do with groups of learners in different stages of development. It's hard sometimes to motivate learners' performance on low-stake assignments. Intensive dedication required to continue ongoing assessment may not be practical for a large enrollment class. Time-consuming also for instructor to provide effective feedback to each and every learner depending his or her own personal learning process. Formative assessment is useful for teachers during the lesson, during the weekly lesson, because have some beneficial items. For example, in formative assessment, teacher monitors or tracks the student's progress throughout the entire teaching learning process. So, formative assessment helps teachers identify students' needs, problem areas, and learning gaps, tackle or resolve them immediately. In formative assessment, students are motivated to be more adventurous, more creative. But some different disadvantages of formative assessment are maybe perhaps it's hard sometimes to motivate learners' performance on low-stake assessments. Also, intensive dedication required to continue ongoing assessment, so may not be practical for large enrollment classes. Time-consuming, also for an instructor to provide effective feedback each every learners. Next, if we conclude that formative and summative assessment, formative and summative assessment are the types of assessment. As we know, formative and summative assessment have some differences. Formative and summative assessments refer not to methods, but rather to interpretations of the assessment data. Formative and summative assessment are very beneficial for teachers to evaluate students. It can be the students' performances. Students' performances can be written or oral form. We will use two types of assessment: formative and summative. Formative assessment is very useful during the lesson. For example, multiple choice. Summative assessment. Summative assessment is useful during the procedure of speaking task. After the speaking task, teacher gives summative assessment. For example, their feedback. The feedback can be positive and negative. A single assessment can be considered as either formative or summative, depending on how the assessment data is collected and interpreted to serve its intended purpose. We can conclude that types of assessment, formative and summative, are very useful in some phases of teaching. not only foreign language, but also first language or target language. Our lesson is over. Thank you very much for your participation. Goodbye. See you soon.